Jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts.
Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. If you guys dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. I wanted you to hear the verdict once more. Basically, guilty on all counts. Indubitably so. I listened to the defense, and like I said before in one of my other videos, that it is a difficult thing to argue that as a police, it is reasonable to put your knee on a man's throat beyond the point where the person stops begging for his life, beyond the point where he stops saying that he couldn't breathe, beyond the point of consciousness, beyond the point of the paramedics getting there, beyond the point of life, and say that, yes, that is reasonable conduct. That's what I needed to do in that particular moment. And again, I keep saying that I watch that and I feel nothing. It's not, even a certain degree of sadness about it. Like I said, there's no justice to be found. There's no way to balance the equation in regards to what that family lost. And more on point in two things. The cops that were there saw nothing weird in Chauvin's behavior. Because as I keep saying, it's typical cop behavior. It's normal. It's not abnormal for them to behave that way, for them to ignore a person saying they can't breathe or they can't get air or that they're in pain, etc., etc. They ignore that stuff. They become tone deaf to people and the suffering to which they are imparting. And they act and function with a certain degree of impunity. I don't think that's outlandish. I think it's somewhat obvious just from, I can give you 1,000 videos on it within 20 minutes. It's voluminous in regards to the way it happens, and it's incentivized by a culture, in one respect, by the fact that they can dispense force, and there is very little consequence. They can beat you senseless and then charge you with assault for bleeding on them as they're beating you. Yes, that's happened before. I'm making the point that this is the police force. This is what we have in America. Him getting convicted is statistically on point. It's not indicative of anything real. And that's the point I'm trying to make. I understand people can celebrate specifically saying, yes, we locked him up. But that's somewhat separate and distinct from what does it mean in the larger context of things. And unfortunately, like I say, 99% of cops walk. No charges. By the same token, by definition, that means that at the very least, there will be 1% or a fraction of that 1% that get charged. Chauvin, in that case, was just so over the top that he represented a fraction of that 1% that got charged, that you have to be that outlandish to get charged. And despite being that outlandish, the public still thought that there was a chance that he could get off. I thought Chauvin was guilty of sin, and I thought he was going to be convicted. I had no feelings about that verdict other than good. He's going to be prosecuted for that. But I think that the somber melancholy I have with this is nothing has changed in cop culture. Nothing has changed economically to change the areas to which some of the crimes and whatnot are taking place. Nothing has changed in the context of accountability from the standpoint of police officers, especially not from a federal level, even though you may have something here or something there. And there is not even a thought beyond the bad apple stuff. Like even looking at the precinct. I'm making the point that nobody really wants to deal with this issue from the standpoint of trying to solve it. People often get entrenched in their sides. One side wants to bring up the person or the victim as saying that that person is somehow culpable. The other side wants to only talk about the cop. The reality of it is, in some of these situations, the cop is entirely guilty. By the same token, once you deal with the cop's guilt, you can also ask that question about why is the situation to the point that that person is living in that bad? And can we do something about that? And shouldn't we do something about that? Those tend to be off the table in regards the conversation. The other part to this that should be disconcerting is that, like I said, it's normal. It's normal. What happened in that situation was absolutely and entirely normal. And something else that's normal that should be disconcerting is the way that cops described the murder. And I mean murder in the literal sense, since you were just shown him being convicted, Derek Chauvin being convicted of murder in multiple counts. So, yeah. So, the crime that took place, that's normal. It will happen again. Murders by cops definitely happen, and they happen quite often, 1,000 times a year. Like I said, 99%. Nothing is done to change that, to stop that at all, actually. In fact, it's going to happen again. Everybody knows it's going to happen again. So this is not justice in the sense of, okay, we've stopped this. We've dealt with this. We're going to deal with the poverty in the various communities. We're going to deal with the cops and the way the cops dispense justice. We're going to deal with accountability and the way the cops go about their affairs when they breach and go beyond the thing. We may even reimagine policing in and of itself. We're going to ensure that the communities that are in disrepute are no longer in disrepute. We're going to make sure that anybody that wants a job can get a job. That's what we're going to do. We're going to build back better. 560,000 people died. Many of the people that died were poor and in communities where they were forced to go and work, oftentimes working. So we, people who didn't have to go into offices, could eat, or that we would get food delivered to the house and everything else. They put themselves on the line. They were supposed to be heroes, and all of a sudden, they're not. So they're not worth $15 an hour. If you create conditions that are more favorable by going in a direction that is, if you want to call it straight, then you could cut down on the amount of crime. You can cut down on the areas that are in disrepute. You can create vibrant communities. We choose not to do those things. And instead, we use cops. And I'm saying, if you're trying to solve an issue, you have to ask, why does a kid have a gun? And more importantly, or just as importantly, you have to deal with the fact of accountability when that cop kills somebody. For fuck's sake. Part of the cop thing, though, is this way in which they can lie on a scene. And for the longest time, when people will point this out, it's as if the justice system couldn't deal with the fact that cops lie, even though everybody knows that cops lie. And so I want to show you George Floyd's record, meaning when the cops explained what happened. Now, this came out just before the video came out. So assume for the moment decades. When people say cops did X, and in the record, it wasn't in the record. So the judge didn't accept it. And so the only thing you got was the cops' version of events that was accepted in the newspapers and everything else. Shouldn't you question that after reading George Floyd's arrest report? And it's not even his arrest report. It's the report put out by the Minneapolis Police Department to explain what happened when Floyd was killed, murdered by Derek Chauvin. Right here. You're going to love this. No, you're not. You're going to love it in a way that it's going to piss you off. So this is the document. Man dies after medical incident during police interaction. All right, sounds pretty plain and vanilla. This, I'm just expanding it up so I can see it. Under the heading, man dies after incident during police interaction, the statement, which has since been deleted from the website. Oh, you shouldn't have deleted it. You shouldn't delete that. Don't delete that statement. On Monday evening, shortly after 8 o'clock p.m., officers from the Minneapolis Police Department responded to the 3700 block of Chicago South on a report of forgery in progress. Officers were advised that the suspect was sitting on top of a blue car and appeared to be under the influence. 2 officers arrived and located the suspect, a male believed to be in his 40s, in his car. He was ordered to step from the car. After he got out, he physically resisted officers. Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. He was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center with ambulance, where he died short time later. No officers were injured in the incident, because that's what's entirely important. That's the thing that's always important, right? That no cop get injured in whatever they are engaged in. Now, you know what happened to Floyd. You know what happened to Floyd. That was the document that they put out to describe what happened to Floyd. One man subduing another man and physically murdering that man in painstaking detail for 9 minutes. 9 minutes of asphyxiation, 9 minutes of distress, 9 minutes of a man who knew his life was coming to an end, up to the point he lost consciousness and his life actually did come to an end. And the way that the police officers, with all of the powers at their disposal, with all of the authority at their disposal, and their ability to shape and perpetuate a narrative where the public itself is excluded from what is taking place. The family, on some level, is isolated and alienated. And the cop writes a report. This is what happened. Period. And under normal circumstances, decades, nobody could really challenge it. It's your word against the cops. And the courts trust the cops, especially if you were an African American and you didn't necessarily have the money to challenge it. That's one of the other things. You realize that one of the things that takes place is that cops, especially in poor communities, would use the poor communities in regards to traffic tickets, in regards to fines and these little over-policing, because the thought is they were using those communities in order to fund the smaller counties instead of charging taxes to the other residents that maybe could afford it. That's what they were doing to some of those residents. So those residents would get additional fines. Sometimes they would end up in jail because they couldn't afford the fines. I mean, these are poor communities. This is stuff that takes place in regards to various cities. It is also more advantageous to go after poor communities because on some level, yes, the crime is going to be there. But on another level, this is also the area where they have less likely are able to defend themselves from the standpoint of cash and lawyers, etc. Look, my argument is that at the end of the day, if you really want to get rid of crime, it's not a cop issue. It's an economic issue. Crime becomes rational when other avenues are closed off. And not just other avenues are closed off. When this notion of risk versus reward fall into the line of, I don't necessarily think I'm going to get caught. I think I can get a big reward out of it. As opposed to, I have a lot to lose if I do get caught. The difference between those things is the level of resources that the person have at their disposal. That is not an absolute for all cases. But from the standpoint of saying, okay, what if I can knock 30% of crime off of the table? Yes, I would take that any day of the week. And I suspect it would have downstream effects that would knock it even that much more so. That takes place for pretty much any crime. If it wasn't for the videotape, that statement would have been the way this would have been understood and described in perpetuity. And Chauvin, who just got convicted of a murder, would have went home, had a hamburger, talked to his kids, and putted around a bit. If there was any kind of investigation at all, they would have read the report. The other three officers who were going to be going to trial, they would have been talked to. They would have been explained that the story that Chauvin in the document is basically correct. That there was a problem. We subdued him. He had medical distress. The end. But you saw the video. How do you trust any of the statements that are coming out of cops after seeing that? This is not a situation where any of them thought anything strange was taking place. They were being videotaped, and they did what they did in the broad daylight of day because in their heads, this is what we typically do. It's almost like cursing in front of your parents. You typically don't. Every so often you do it by accident and your parents, said something. Well, they were in the broad daylight. They didn't think they were doing anything wrong. What happens when they're not in broad daylight? And when they are not in broad daylight, why should any individual, especially a person of color, trust cops? And when I say a person of color, I am even going so far as to say, even from the standpoint of whites, you're not bulletproof. Even though you may get the benefit of the doubt in some of these cases that somebody of color may not. How do you trust cops in this situation? Why should they be able to operate without a body camera? And don't, at some level, you forfeit your right to assume honesty. Or you forfeit your right to engage the public in a one-on-one situation where one person has this infinite authority and the other person just has to accept. And that's infinite authority, even if they're wrong. Even if they're wrong. Because in this situation, they can murder you and then turn around and write a document that basically said you were the one that was going after them. I'm saying that this document is not abnormal. This document is normal as can be. This is the point that I'm trying to make here, I think, with these videos, is that this is not a bad apple. You're going to have media and people chest thump as if this is the rejuvenation of America. See, we're a fair country. Look at this. Chauvin got it, what he deserved. The system worked. Did the system work? 99% walk. One random guy who went so far over the edge that everybody put a knife in him. Is that really the system working? Or is the system working in the way that they're talking about? Being exceptional would be, how do we get rid of poverty? How about that? And within the context of getting rid of poverty, we're going to take a direct shot at crime. That's what we're going to do. We're going to make policing fairer. That's what we're going to do. We're going to deal with the economic inequities that are associated in our country. We're going to ensure that people can go to school when they want to go to school, get healthcare when they want healthcare. And on top of that, we're going to make sure that policing is not killing 1,000 people a year. That's what we're going to do. That's leadership. That's when you really want to solve a problem. That's not people getting into their entrenched sides and just saying the cop is guilty in all counts, and the other side basically saying, well, no, the victim is a horrible person, and because the victim is a horrible person, that it is okay for that victim to be murdered. It's not that. It's something that's a little bit more enlightened and trying to ask, how do you stop that kid from getting the gun? How do you stop that community from falling apart? How do you stop that school from falling apart? How do you stop that cop from killing that person? How do you stop that cop from picking on that person? Or for that matter, considering that person who's basically a school teacher some kind of hostile threat because that person looks different? If a doctor is performing a service, doing his job, the most people are the people that the patient or the doctor is going to get are going to be normal days. You may have a typical doctor, let's say you're a family doctor, and 90% of the people who come into the family doctor, it's just going to be a normal visit. But you will have, on some random day, some percentage that the person comes in and has some kind of medical emergency. And the doctor, who doesn't typically have to deal with medical emergencies, is now required to act. In the context of how that doctor acts, despite the fact that this is atypical, the doctor has a skill set and a knowledge base and a group of peers that will criticize and will evaluate how he behaved in this emergency, because he is expected that despite the adversity and despite the fact that it is an emergency, he's expected to behave rationally and competently in dealing with it. If the person had a heart attack, it's not so much that he is always going to save the patient, but the way he goes about trying to save the patient can be evaluated for competence and whether or not he did the right thing and did his job properly. This is no different than somebody writing software. Meaning, if you write code and that code ends up getting hacked because you didn't necessarily do the right thing and when you were writing the code, or you were lazy, or you took this easy way out, you could be prosecuted. Just like that doctor who, if he kills the patient because he did something wrong, then that doctor would definitely lose his job. That doctor may get sued, and that doctor, depending on how bad it was, if he was drunk or something else, may actually go to jail. This is no different for a police officer. Just because the field is different doesn't necessarily mean that the functionality or the thing that the individual needs to do or the competence that the individual needs to display is different. The areas are different, yes. But the fact that the individual is going to encounter some problem on some particular day that is going to demand a certain degree of competence on his behalf that is not necessarily the normal, routine, particular thing, that is just part of life, and that is part of any job that any particular individual is doing. Some are going to be harder than others. It's not an excuse to kill the individual. And if there's a way for that individual to get out alive and the cop doesn't take it, then yes, charges should be brought against the cop just out of the situation of fairness and to cut down on that notion of unaccountability that allows them to pull that weapon. Maximum justice on a whim. Because they know 99% of the time they're not even going to be charged. And even if they are charged, only 1%, only 33% of that 1% go to jail. They can murder you and then put out that document. How many times has a document like this been put out to describe abuse, beatings, killings? How many times? How many times does a person just not say anything about it because they don't want the cop to come back and get them? They think that the cop may injure them. Or for that matter, they don't have the money to do anything about it one way or the other, so they just have to accept the abuse. The anger that is displayed against police officers are coming directly from the behavior of those police officers and the direct unaccountability for decades. That's where that anger is coming from. The zero tolerance effect. The person, or the 16-year-old that just got killed, apparently she called the cops. She had a knife, and she was going after somebody with the knife. The cop comes out, sees somebody with a knife, and shoots, and kills the person with the knife, which is apparently the girl that had called. Honest truth is, if a cop comes on a scene, the question becomes, Does the cop need to kill the person in that moment? The person is going after somebody else, and the cop is not going to have the knowledge to know whether or not the person who he's going after, meaning he has no idea who called him. He just sees somebody in danger. Does he have to kill a person? That's the evaluation. If the answer is there's no way for this cop to get out of this situation alive himself without killing that other person, then that's understandable. It is not understandable, however, if honest evaluation is, no, you didn't have to pull the gun. You could have used some other method in order to get that person out alive. Then yes, that should be a problem, and people should have some feelings about that. This case, though, is far grayer than some of the other cases. But if you notice, it's zero tolerance, but the zero tolerance is coming from the behavior of cops and the impunity by which they act for the last, God knows how long, centuries or whatever. That's where this is coming from. This is the truth of policing. And until we as a society appropriate that, acknowledge that, especially in the way that they deal with minorities, that anger, that hostility is going to stay. Floyd is never going to get justice. By the same token, Chauvin is going to jail. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I don't want this one to go long. I'm going to say like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all.